After we came into exile in 1959, till about 1973-74, that is what His Holiness says, we have been fighting for Tibetan independence, not autonomy. Because from Tibetan perspective, we have always been an independent state, never occupied by any country or never directly administered by any neighboring country, including China. So that is why we followed seeking complete independence from China from 1959 till about 1973-74, when His Holiness first started thinking about negotiated settlement with the Chinese. Because when we talk about 1973, you will realize that this was at the peak of cultural revolution inside Tibet, 66 to 76, when everything was being destroyed by the Red Army, including about 6,000 Tibetan monasteries and 1.2 million Tibetans having died as a direct or indirect result of Chinese occupation. Then from 1973 onwards, His Holiness started thinking about a negotiated solution, what is today termed as the middle way policy, derived from a Buddhist concept. And that was manifested in the 5-point peace proposal of His Holiness to the US Congress way back in 1987. At that time, we had few friends in the US Congress, including both the Senate and the House, must be about just 10 members, including now the Speaker Emerita, Nancy Pelosi, who was a new member at that time, way back in 1987. And His Holiness proposed the 5-point peace proposal, and then His Holiness expanded on the 5th point on negotiation at the Strasbourg proposal in 1988, when he spoke to the European Parliament, expanding on the 5th point of the 5-point peace proposal. And the response from the Chinese government was not as we expected. So His Holiness in 1992 at Yale University said that the conditions that I had set, now I'm not bound by those conditions. And then, since then, His Holiness started speaking directly to the Tibetan people. And particularly in 1994, March 10th statement, His Holiness mentioned that I will refer to the Tibetan public as to what future course of action we should be taking. And then we followed a process of, we wanted to conduct a referendum, but before conducting the referendum, we had a process of public opinion, out of which about 65.4% of the Tibetan public said that whatever His Holiness decides based on the global political situation, changes in China and in Tibet, we will abide by that. And because of the large majority of the Tibetans who expressed those opinions, we didn't have to go through a process of referendum. Based on that outcome, the Tibetan Parliament in exile unanimously passed a resolution very much in line with what the public had decided, that based on the international situation in China and in Tibet, whatever His Holiness decides, we will abide by that. And after that, His Holiness said that we will continue with the middle way policy. And that is where we are still today, here on the same position. And if we need to change this program, if we need to change this policy, then I cannot change it just because I am the elected political leader today, or the parliament cannot change it. We will have to go through a process of referendum in a very transparent way if there need to be changes in policies in future. Now, based on this policy, we have been pursuing, you know about the engagements that happened between 2002 to 2010 between the Central Tibetan Administration and the Chinese government, which of course did not yield the kind of result that we expected. Of course, China was using that to make sure that there were no protests against the coming out party of China, which is hosting the Olympics. Once the Olympics was over, then the dialogue also stopped in 2010, and since then there have been no progress whatsoever. And in 2021, May 27th, I came into this office. I had been in the Tibetan Parliament for 20 years, from 1996 to 2016, including as Speaker of the Parliament for 7.5 years, from 2008 to 2016. And when I came into this office, we decided to change our strategy a little bit. When His Holiness speaks about middle way, then of course we are talking about polarities or ends. Without ends, there cannot be middle. So one political end, of course, there are so many definitions to how many ends are there, and experts like Professor Samdang Rinpoche can talk about 10 different ends or 8 different ends. So, and that for the general public, it's difficult to understand. So I stick to the only 2 political ends. One is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state, and the other is the current situation of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government. So we, of course, when we travel internationally from the CTA side, from the non-governmental organizations who always advocate for the Tibetan cause, including Tibet supporters and parliamentary groups, we reach out. When we reach out to them, then we speak about these major issues. One, the focus, of course, what is happening in Tibet, we keep reminding them from time to time, whatever we get to hear on time or late or whatever information we have, all of us give those information to as many governments as possible. But when we speak about middle way, the Tibetan community is also quite conservative, thinking that when we speak about middle way, we cannot speak about the independent status of Tibet. So which I thought is quite narrow-minded in our approach. So we decided to focus on seeking recognition for the historical status of Tibet to gain value for the middle way. Otherwise, there's no value for the middle way. China is not responding to that. And what is important for China is sovereignty. Its sovereignty over, and its sovereignty claim over Tibet. So one message that we wanted to give is to the Chinese government that they cannot distort Tibetan history, whether it's in a person's life or whether it's in a nation's life. History is history. It's past. You, just because of the whims and fancies of some political leaders, you cannot change history. So that message has to be sent clear to the Chinese authorities that Tibet has always been an independent state. And the second is to the international community. The international community keeps repeating the statement that Tibet is part of the People's Republic of China. And when you say that, then I tell them that you're going against international law, because what is happening to Ukraine today, or what happened to Tibet 75 years ago, it was the same international law. There's only one international law. There are no 2 international laws. And Tibet was also forcefully occupied. Under the threat of war, we were forced to sign the 17-point agreement on May 23rd, 1951. And before that, we were militarily, forcefully occupied. Chamdo in October 1950. So that should be null and void under international law. And the second thing we tell the international community is that why do you think Chinese government is asking every other government to say Tibet is part of China? Why is Chinese government not asking other governments to say East Turkestan is part of China, or Mongolia is part of China, or Manchuria is part of China? Why only Tibet? That is because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy of their rule in Tibet, and they are trying to seek that legitimacy from the international community. So even today, if I make a statement from Dharamsala which the Beijing government does not like, and the spokesperson would say the Tibetan government, the so-called Tibetan government in exile is not recognized by any government in this world. That's how they measure the legitimacy. So we try to impress upon the international community to give recognition for Tibet's historical status. And the third reason is for the Tibetan population, ourselves. Now we are in diaspora. Inside Tibet, you cannot study Tibetan history. You cannot now, under the new colonial-style boarding schools, you cannot study Tibetan language or history or literature, all of that. And the Tibetans here in the diaspora community, in India and Nepal, we are still okay. We run our schools. But Tibetans who have now moved to other countries, they are born and brought up in a totally different environment. And if Tibetans don't study Tibetan history, then who else will study Tibetan history? So if we have to fight for Tibetan independence or Tibetan autonomy, both ways you need to prove the historical status of Tibet. And the fourth reason is also, I keep telling, within the Tibetan community also we have differences of opinion between independent, middle way, this, that. So that causes a lot of divisiveness within the community. And I say this is not necessary right now. That is why we have created platforms like WeTag, Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Groups, where more than 800 young Tibetans have joined this group from different countries around the world. Tibetans for Tibet at the forefront. Tibetans have to be at the forefront of Tibetan struggle. Then you can ask others to join. That is why, of course, we have challenges, we have a lot of opportunities also. The challenges is that the younger generations of Tibetans are moving out from here. And the opportunity is that now these young generations have become citizens in different countries. They speak the language, they understand the system. If they know a little more about what's happening in China and in Tibet and the implications of global political situation on Tibet, then they would be the best advocate for Tibet. So that is the reason why we adopted this change in strategy and worked with the US government for 2 long years, from 22 April to 24 July, to get this Resolve Tibet Act passed. We consider this as one step forward in our advocacy work. And this law talks about certain elements that challenges China's narrative. Because China always says that Tibet is not a problem. There is no Tibet problem. But this law says that Tibet is yet to be a resolved problem. Sino-Tibet dispute. We don't just call it Tibetan issue. It's a Sino-Tibet dispute. I wanted to call it Sino-Tibet conflict, but the US government decided to put dispute instead of conflict. So we got this passed, and the first element says Tibet is yet to be resolved conflict and it needs to be resolved under international law. The second element of the law talks about the Tibetan people's right to self-determination, which is very much in line with the UN General Assembly's resolution on Tibet in 1961. And the third element of this law also talks about the misinformation from Chinese side on Tibetan historical narrative, that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Sometimes they say time immemorial. The Chinese government, they themselves don't know what time they're talking about. So when it comes to history, of course, they are on very thin ice. And this law says that His Holiness has not accepted this narrative that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, and this US government also does not recognize this narrative. And other elements of the law also talks about countering China's disinformation on Tibetan history and working with other like-minded countries around the world to adopt similar position. And the last part of that law talks about the territorial space of Tibet, which includes all the 3 provinces, not just Tibet Autonomous Region. So this, we put in a lot of effort to get this law passed in the United States, because it's quite a cumbersome process, having to go through the House and then the Senate and then reconciliation, and all that took about 2 years, but we got that through. And we continue to receive good support from the US government, even during the Trump's second presidency. I was there as representative of His Holiness in DC when Trump was there for the first time as president way back in 2017. And right now, we work very closely with the State Department. And I think there are a lot of papers on India's position on the Sino-Tibet conflict. So we are watching every development around this world, what China is doing with AP4, with ASEAN, ASEAN Plus, with SCO, with BRICS, with G20. One space we have is G7, so we still get mentioned in G7 communiques, and I keep reminding the G7 leadership not to forget Tibet. But G20, we don't get mentioned because China is always there, and China has its proxies in all the regions, whether it's South China, whether you're talking about ASEAN. You can't have a unanimity of decision on South China Sea. I'm Professor Kondapalli, and all of you are more expert on these. But there are a lot of developments that we have to keep watching. In ASEAN also, with Laos and Cambodia in China's hand, there can never be a unanimity on Indo-Pacific or China or its activities in the South China Sea. With the SCO, it's most of their people, but now not able to produce too much results as a multilateral forum. Then you have BRICS, you have G20. So all of those platforms, we are watching every single step of the Chinese government. We are also trying to see what changes are happening at the political level, even though it's very opaque. If you watch over a longer period and try to listen more, then you get more news. Of course, Professor Kondapalli and others in Delhi also know more, sometimes more than us, and sometimes we know a little more than them. So, of course, we share our information as well. So that's the steps that we have taken so far. And one thing we are trying to do this year is since we celebrated His Holiness' 90th birthday, for the first time there were 216 journalists in Dharamsala to cover the event. Even though very few governments and leaders made statements, the media all around the world wanted to know what His Holiness had to say. So this 90th birthday, the only one document that's available on His Holiness' reincarnation was a September 2011 document, wherein he states that when he reaches the age of 90, he will make a statement, which he did on July 2nd, because His Holiness has responded to many questions in different ways. When he was asked whether the next Dalai Lama could be a woman, His Holiness says, yes, why not? Because mother have a natural compassion towards their child. And then when His Holiness is asked whether it could be an emanation, His Holiness says, oh, that's also possible, because that practice was there in Tibet. And sometimes His Holiness says, I could be the last Dalai Lama. So there have been various responses from His Holiness' side. And after I became Sikyong, when I visited the United States and I met some people in the National Security Council, and they were telling me, oh, you don't seem to have a process in place. I said, that's your perspective. Some of our friends in India, and we believe that the decision that His Holiness has taken is very, very smart. Because if there is one thing that Chinese government cannot handle, is unpredictability. So if His Holiness decides from now as to what is going to happen to his reincarnation, then China will use all its powers and resources to influence the global opinion on their side. So this time, His Holiness made the statement that the institution of the Gandeng Podang Trust of His Holiness the Dalai Lama will continue, and the lineage of the Dalai Lama will continue. Now, how that will happen, whether it will be emanation, reincarnation, of course, if you look at most of the terminology, it points more towards reincarnation, but that's not decided, because reincarnation has to be found only after the death of the Lama, not before that. The Western media thought, of course, we can't blame them, because Christians, Islam, some religions don't believe in life after death. So when we lobby in Europe also, first they tell us, first you explain about reincarnation, make us understand what the whole concept is, then we will see how to support. So that takes a lot of educational work also. I think the 216 journalists who were here in Dharamsala For them also, it was a very good educational experience having to stay in Dharamsala for almost 1 week to celebrate His Holiness' 90th birthday, because the weather was bad, flights were getting cancelled, so it was not easy to get out of Dharamsala also at that time. So good that they stayed back and they managed to cover the 90th birthday celebration as well as the other aspects of Tibetan diaspora life, including the exiled Central Tibetan Administration's work here. So immediately after His Holiness' statement, that was on the first day of the religious conference that we organized. So this happening after 6-7 years. This religious conference was not picked up so much by the international media, but for us as Tibetans, it's very important process of decision making. So this religious conference supported and approved in total what His Holiness has proposed in terms of his reincarnation. And then the Parliament met here in September. The Parliament also passed a regulation. So all in all, it was a complete circle. And what we have been trying to do is to get evidence and declarations from Tibetan community, because the first community that gets impacted by His Holiness' reincarnation is the Tibetan community. So both inside and outside, Tibetans inside don't have the freedom to express themselves. So Tibetans in the diaspora community, almost every organization, every monastic center have issued declarations and statements about what they want His Holiness to do. And based on that, His Holiness issued these statements. So we have collected all those statements. Then we went beyond that to the Tibetan Buddhist world, the Himalayas and the Mongols and the Russian republics of Kalmykia, Tuva, Buryat, and other adherents of Buddhism, of Tibetan Buddhism. They have also passed resolutions in their respective constituencies, and we have collected all of those. And then when we travel internationally, we reached out to Buddhist unions, which represents not just Tibetan Buddhism, but other traditions of Buddhism, including Pali tradition. So there's Italy Buddhist Union, French Buddhist Union, every country have Buddhist unions, so we urged them to, each one of them to issue statements. And then the last is nations. So US is the only one that has a law on Tibet in the form of US Tibet Policy of 2002, which has been amended to Tibet Support and Policy Act of 2020, wherein they have included the element of His Holiness reincarnation, which also talks about sanctioning Chinese officials who will be responsible for choosing or selecting the next Dalai Lama. So based on that, I was in UK and Germany end of June, met with the foreign ministries, and both assured that they will issue policy statements regarding His Holiness reincarnation. And they also mentioned that they are in discussion with France, which they normally do between the three big powers in Europe on such matters. And later, immediately after His Holiness' official birthday on July 6th, there was a joint statement by 7 nations led by UK, Germany, France, and joined by Holland, who had also passed several resolutions last year after our visit there. And Iceland, normally I have not been able to travel to Iceland, but they always support human rights issues in Tibet. And then Estonia and Lithuania, 7 nations issued a joint statement, not from the foreign ministry, who assured us, but came from the religious ambassadors, religious freedom ambassadors of these 7 nations. And now we'll have to work with the other European countries to see whether the European, because there was for the first time, there was a Czech president, a sitting president of Czech Republic, Peter Pavel, came to Ladakh to have an audience with His Holiness, and we also met him separately and also asked him to issue statements, if not singularly, being afraid of having to counter China, if not singularly, they can do jointly with other European countries. Maybe the Scandinavians can come out together. Even with the Canadians, last week I was in Canada, and I requested Canada also to come out with statement, if not singularly by themselves, at least with 5 eyes, so that they are not targeted singularly by the Chinese government. There could be some joint response. So this is how we try to reach out to the international community to give you some a bird's eye view of what we are trying to do. I travel around 6-7 months a year internationally. I've traveled to more than 27 countries so far. We're trying to reach more countries and more repeatedly. And to the US, every year we have to go at least 2-3 times, because that's also one source of our income from the government side. There was funding cut to everybody, but half of our funding have been restored. We worked very hard to get it back in Washington, D.C. At the Hill, at the State Department, at the council level, everywhere, but we got half of it back, and we will pursue. It's not enough to get half of the appropriated budget for this year, but we have to make sure that it's mentioned in the appropriations to come, otherwise you don't get those money. So all these are happening at various levels, and one of the things I've been telling my people also is that now when His Holiness is alive, we receive some respect from the other governments. And now we have to, because we often get asked questions about what will happen when His Holiness is not there, what will happen during the interregnum period before the next reincarnation. His Holiness has been preparing us from 1960 onwards. Under very difficult circumstances, His Holiness introduced democracy. And today we are in a situation where an ordinary person like me can become the Sikyong, the political leader. And now, since 2001 to 2011, His Holiness said, I'm semi-retired. So Professor Samdong Rinpoche almost handled everything on his own from the administrative side. And then that was followed by 10 years of Lobsang Sengge's Sikyongship, and then my first term here now, 5 years. So we already have 25 years of experience running the exile government. And we seek His Holiness intervention and advice only when necessary, particularly to do with dialogue with China. So otherwise, we manage everything ourselves. So there are a lot of concerns. As long as the Tibetans remain united here in the diaspora community, I'm sure we'll get through every challenges that we'll have to face in the future. And from our side, as we work today, we also prepare for the future, right? Set precedents, set protocols with other governments, meet as many governments as possible, try to increase our visibility. So last year I had a 5-minute meeting with President Macron, and this year we met with the Czech president. So eventually, if we get to meet with more ministers, more prime ministers, then our profile also goes up. And in the absence of His Holiness, we will be able to carry through our political responsibility. So I want to end with this high note of hope. We will never lose hope. We will never. So such scholars' conferences are very important, which is the 7th of its kind. And when you have so many young scholars, young professors, then we are creating this network of people, knowledgeable people who can write about Tibet, spread more awareness about Tibet, and get people to know more about Tibet. And I will also make efforts to reach out to as many Indian universities and colleges as possible. And we have a very transparent relation with MAA and other agencies that we have to work with. Of course, I have always said we have to keep two realities in mind. If there has to be a resolution to the Sino-Tibet conflict through the middle way policy, then it can be done only by talking with the Chinese. It will not come from anywhere else. That's a reality we have to face. And the other reality is, till such a time that we are able to reach a negotiated solution with the Chinese, then we have to reach out to the international community. His Holiness also says we have two hands. So we extend both our hands. If the Chinese hold our hand, then we will say bye-bye to the international community. If they don't hold a hand, then we will have to stick with the international community to get support for us. So that we'll keep doing, we'll keep trying. And since COVID, there have been a lot more interest in understanding China, and we understand better than many Europeans and Americans. And I also traveled to South America, and I realized that there is not a single think tank in South America studying China. Nobody to recommend policies to the government. And when I was in Mexico last, the former foreign minister was openly called as the China boy. His nickname was China boy because he was used by the Chinese government and there are a lot of studies also being done. Just last week I was in Canada, as I mentioned before, and Dr. Charles Barton, who had studied in Fudan University, one of the biggest critics in Canada on China, he's also coming out with a book called The Beaver and the Dragon this month. So beaver being the Canadian national animal and the dragon. So I will end with this anecdote. When I go to Europe and others, I speak about all these things, and then I ask them, what is the takeaway from my talks? And they say, oh, we don't want to be donkeys. Because I tell them, if you kowtow to the Chinese too much, right now you are on your two legs, then your hands will also become legs, and China will keep riding you, and you will become the donkey. So our parliamentary friends say, oh, we don't want to be donkeys. And then the other thing they say is, oh, the dragon is biting at us. Then I tell them, at one time, dragon was very weak. China was very weak at one time. Who made the dragon so strong to be able to bite at you? It is United States, it's Europe, it's Taiwan, it's Japan, all the countries that surround. They made China for what China is today. Now, knowing that the dragon is biting at you, if you still keep feeding the dragon, then whose fault is it? I keep saying that. I think India will also learn its lessons. Despite the boundary issues and all that, business is going up, not in India's favor. The balance of trade is all in China's favor. There are very few countries that have trade surplus with China, including Australia. And when I was in Australia in July, the next day, Prime Minister Albanese was going to China for a 6-day visit tour. And I told the Australians, you don't need clairvoyance. We can tell by reason that in the next 10 months to 1 year, the trade surplus that you have with China will be washed off, because China is going to force you to buy more. All the Southeast Asian countries are buying more. Over the last 2-3 months, it has increased by more than 20%. When I was in Germany, they were clearly saying, media is talking about China using charm offensive in Europe. And Germans say it's not charm offensive, it's coercive economics. So in May and June alone, Germany saw 20% increase of imports from China, because Germany is too dependent on China for rare earth. Some of their factories got closed because of shortage of rare earth, and because of the supply chain problems, China is forcing you to buy more. You have no choice. It's not charm offensive, it's definitely coercive economics. So all these realities of what China is doing in Africa, in Latin America, all around the world, creating dead economies, all those things, I think, need to be made known more to the global community, understand China's motivations behind all the actions. When I was in Mexico, I went to Guadalajara, first time, and some 200 Mexicans came to receive me because of our friendship with a member of parliament from that local area. But the Chinese embassy said, if the president of Guadalajara meets with Pemba Tsering, we're going to cancel the metro project. So sometimes we feel we are quite powerful to be able to stop something, but we have nothing to offer to the world except mental peace and the message of Buddha, which comes from India. So we have to use all our means to the second reality. We said no country is going to leave their interests, national interests, for the interests of Tibet. Nobody will do that. So understanding those, the mantra is how do we align our national interests with that country's national interests, and then see how we can go together. And that's what we have been trying to do, not just talk about politics, but also economics, military, security, all kinds of issues that concerns that country. And that works, that kind of worked over the last 4 years in our advocacy work, reaching out to the global community, and also convincing the Tibetan community to come together as one, not to be divisive. In the next election, I have no plan to campaign. And if I win the election, then maybe I'll write a book, How to Win Elections Without Campaigning. Thank you.